Our discussion on laws that took effect on August 1st continues now with Senator Sean Nenow, and the senator joins me right now to talk a little bit about his legislation that changes intentional wildfire laws. So thanks for joining us. We appreciate this.
Glad to be here.
So Senator, let's begin with these changes. Apparently they stemmed from an incident in your district. Why don't you share the backstory?
Well, it was a fire in the Carlos Avery Preserve. The actual fire actually wasn't in the district I represent, but Carlos Avery comes up into the area that I represent in southern Chisago County. The fire was actually, I believe, in Washington and maybe in Anoka counties. Destroyed thousands of acres of wilderness, but it endangered many homes and many acres of valuable cropland. Now, fortunately, in this case, there were no homes that were burned, there were no lives that were lost, none of the firefighters were terribly injured, but we had, I'm trying to remember the numbers, I want to say like a couple of hundred firefighters involved and dozens of trucks. They even called out the National Guard helicopters because this was an extensive fire. After the fact, eventually they determined that it was arson and they found out who committed the crime. Basically, the gentleman walked away with some probation.
And so your law is going to change that, and it's because there were no structures that had actually been burnt down. That's right. What this law addresses. Right,
because basically it was wilderness. It didn't really burn cropland, so it didn't create monetary loss. Because it didn't actually burn the homes, there wasn't that personal property loss and the monetary loss that would go with that, but you had this tremendous effort, which is the only reason that was prevented, was this tremendous effort. And the fine and the punishment that could be meted out on this individual because of the current law at the time it was just minimal, even though you had 100 homes that were threatened and many, many acres of valuable cropland. The law was changed so that it doesn't have to burn down a house, an arson fire. Doesn't have to necessarily create that monetary loss. But if you have that threatened, if the arson fire, as a result of being set, then does threaten those buildings, and there's a tiered structure within the bill, so if it's so many of this and so many of that, it's this fine, and it can work its way up to a felony.
And I won't ask you to talk about all of those different tiers, but I did see that in this particular case, the damage would have likely resulted in a 9-year prison term. The bill allows for up to 10 years. Now, there wasn't much opposition to your legislation, but I did read that a few people did feel the punishment could exceed the crime at this point. What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, that could be the case with any crime. I mean, you look at some of these minor drug crimes in kids, because oftentimes it's kids, but, you know, guys and gals going to jail for 10, 15 years for using an illegal substance. There are people that say, well, you know, who are we? They weren't selling, you know, they just happened to possess it for their own use. Well, you know, that argument can be made for probably most of the laws that we have.
Okay, I want to ask you, just a hypothetical, but I'm trying to differentiate between what constitutes arson and what could just be an accident. Yeah. Let's say I'm just burning some dry branches in my backyard. The wind kicks up, carries it away. Next thing you know, you have a wildfire. Does that qualify as arson under this bill?
Arson comes down to intent. You know, did you intentionally set a fire that you wanted to burn out of control? In that particular case, you wouldn't have arson, you know, unless the arsonist was really smart and said, I know, I'm going to set a fire right next to this dry field because then I can claim that I was just roasting my hot dogs out in the middle of nowhere next to the dry field. But no, if you were having a backyard barbecue and there's a history of that, and what would happen in that case is you could maybe get into some negligence charges and, you know, restitution and things like that.
And that is my last question for you. In the case of many wildfires, typically, if there's some arson involved or even an intentional setting of a fire that wasn't negligent or that was just negligent, usually, you know, typically you have to pay for at least a big chunk of fighting that wildfire. Does your law allow for that as well?
Yeah, there are significant fines and penalties as well as prison time that could be meted out for that. And that was part of the problem in the case prior with what precipitated this legislation, is that it was just a nominal fine and, you know, time served in the holding cell is basically what it amounted to, and then some probation.
Okay. Senator Nenow, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you. You have a great day.